Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Wednesday, the 29th of April. Grant Walker will have Heads Up for you on Thursday, the 30th, from 10 o'clock. In dairy industry news, Synlait Milk is reaping the benefits of a fast-selling melatonin-rich milk powder ingredient derived from the practice of night milking on the cooperative's suppliers' farms. Sold in South Korea since January under the Sleepers brand, a powder in a sachet, Synlait's InDream 3 resulted from an independent clinical trial by Otago University's Well Sleep Centre, which established its efficacy as a sleep-promoting ingredient. According to Synlait, which has been developing the product since 2009, InDream 3 is made from melatonin-rich milk collected during the night, when cows naturally produce increased concentrations of melatonin in their milk. The cooperative says the clinical trial took about 2 years and found that InDream 3 decreases sleep onset time while increasing stage N3 sleep time, that is the deepest phase of sleep. Synlait's Research and Development Manager, Dr. Simon Causa, says while there's melatonin-rich milk available on the European market, a powdered milk form is more novel. He says he's aware of 2 commercial night milk products overseas, but neither have backed up their products with the level of clinical proof that Synlait has done with InDream 3. Dr. Causa says the trial structure was a double-blind, randomised, placebo-controlled crossover study, which is scientists speak for the most robust clinical trial design you can get. He says twice each night cow herds are milked from Synlait's pool of suppliers that have expressed interest in producing night milk. As the cooperative receives orders for the milk, it contacts those suppliers to arrange collection on specific nights. Dr. Causa says its product has sold very well in South Korea since its launch 3 months ago, and Synlait is now looking to target larger international banks. And that story from Jamie Ball. In energy industry news, an analyst says if Genesis stock falls any further, it will attract the eyes of bargain hunters. The power company surprised the market on Wednesday morning with its announcement it will not meet its full-year forecasts. The Auckland-based company now says earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortisation and other fair value changes will be between $330 million and $345 million for the year to June the 30th. Genesis's prospectus from March last year estimated it would make $363.4 million. Net income is now expected to be between $85 and $95 million, compared to the prospectus estimate of $95.4 million. Craig's Investment Partners analyst Mark Lister tells NBR Radio, "It's obviously disappointing to see a profit downgrade. It doesn't seem like the market was expecting it, because if it was, there wouldn't be such a strong share price reaction." He says while Genesis management warned at the half-year results in February the company was facing headwinds from weaker global oil prices and aggressive competition for customers, shareholders seemed not to have factored this in until they got confirmation this was a strong reality. Genesis stock price has dropped 7.41% to $2 since the announcement. Mr. Lister says there'll be a few bargain hunters taking notice if the share price falls too much. Under $2 would look attractive, so there's a bit of a floor in terms of weakness in here. New Zealand's largest energy retailer says it's downgraded its forecast due to losing electricity and gas customers as competition ramped up and wholesale electricity prices declined. In the 3 months to March the 31st, Genesis lost 0.3% of its electricity customers, reducing the total to just over 516,000. Its gas customers reduced 1.3% over the quarter to just under 106,800. Mr Lister says this serves as a timely reminder that while the electricity sector is viewed as stable, low risk and predictable, it's not always the case. Contrary to what people think, there's a reasonable amount of volatility in earnings in the sector. And that story from Calida Smiley.
To a 2015 budget update, a further step up in activity by Inland Revenue against property investors appears to be on the way. Finance Minister Bill English says there is ongoing work on the existing Income Tax Act rules, which mean people who buy property with the intention to sell at a profit have the increase in value classed as part of their income for that year and are taxed accordingly. NBR Radio understands no final decisions have yet been made, but increased funding is under consideration. The rules have been in the Income Tax Act since at least 1956, but were only sporadically enforced and somewhat erratically interrupted by the courts. In 2007, however, the then Labour government provided the IRD with an extra $14.6 million over 3 years, specifically to enforce this part of the Income Tax Act. When that funding expired in 2010, the current national government not only gave the IRD another $14.6 million to enforce this law, but doubled it to $26.6 million over 4 years, or $6.65 million a year. In last year's budget, when that funding expired, Mr English rolled it over, made it a permanent part of the IRD's baseline budget, and increased it slightly. His comments yesterday suggest the IRD might get an extra dollop of funding when he delivers Budget 2015 on May the 21st. The extra funding has paid off. In the most recent full year to June 2014, the $6.65 million spent on enforcing reaped $56.65 million in tax. It's worth noting that for all the extra enforcement, there have been no test cases. Those caught have paid up, albeit in some cases after arguing their position before the Taxation Review Authority. The government has clearly decided it's a door it can keep pushing, given there's been no litigation-driven pushback. The issue is not just about tax revenue. Concern about house prices in Auckland rising 20% in 1 year means policymakers, including the Reserve Bank, are concerned about excessive investment in that sector unbalancing the economy. Reserve Bank Deputy Governor Grant Spencer 2 weeks ago hit the headlines with a speech in which he argued the government has to look at all factors driving the Auckland property market, including the large capital gains being made by investors. That was widely and wrongly interpreted as a call for a capital gains tax. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, and it appears likely the government will step up tax enforcement activity using the existing rules.
NBR Radio. With the Property Press. It's out now to show you around.
Hi, I'm Hamish McNichol for NBR Radio. I'm here in the studio with Duncan Bridgman, who's going to be talking to us about one of our stories leading the website today, Orion Health, which has provided a brief business update along with its March quarter cash flow figures. So, Duncan, how did the market view this?
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, well, I think pretty positively on the whole in the context of its previous quarterly update back in January, when it took the market by surprise a bit with some less than favourable forecasts. And as we know, when Orion floated on the stock exchange late last year, it didn't provide any financial forecast in its prospectus. So, and the reason for that is it's difficult to pinpoint accurately what sort of revenue it's going to generate in the future. That's because its contracts can be dependent on timing, and so revenue can be quite lumpy. But this was quite a good quarter update. It showed us positive cash flow, and I think investors will be relieved somewhat that the cash burn rate had eased and been offset by a strong turnaround in customer receipts, which came in at 53 million as opposed to 30 million in the third quarter.
Okay, so you mentioned that the January update was a bit of a surprise to the market. So is this slightly more positive March update, is it a balancing off of that, or is it slightly more as Orion starting to gain some traction now? Or
yeah, I think the previous update was in relation to some delays in contracts, and also the transition that Orion's going through from its perpetual license model to a subscription fee type arrangement, and that's what will bring in recurring revenue, which is a much better ongoing cash flow model. And I think it is actually starting to get some traction. The Chief Executive, Ian McRae, talked about a strong pipeline of potential customers, and they're getting quite a bit of procurement activity, and that's based on the release of some new products as well, which look quite exciting for the company, although any sort of upside in terms of revenue could be a while to come yet.
Right. So what sort of new products then have they come out with?
Well, Orion is it operates in the healthcare management area, and it's looking at this growing market for population health management, and it's all about integrating data and what's this sort of large volumes of healthcare data. So it's just released about 4 new products, which it delivered at its at a big kind of IT conference in Chicago, and one of them is called an open platform, and this is designed to integrate large volumes of, let's say, insurance claims, providers, healthcare providers, and other health data. And this is attracting quite a good deal of attention from what's called the payer market. These are the organisations that pay out big sums towards healthcare. There's other products like something called Allegro. This is a new application and provides secure messaging and chat between patients and their doctors and also other healthcare providers. So these are quite specialist products, and there's potential here to upsell along with its existing products that Orion has. Okay,
so these new products, are they going to help bring the company forward then? What's been holding it back?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think this transition from perpetual licenses through to a subscription model, that takes a lot of integration, and also there has been a bit of a delay in getting some contracts together in the US market, and that's due to a variety of factors. One that was pointed out in our article was that potential customers, big payers, so to speak, are looking for reassurance that the data is going to be secure. There's been some big breaches in the US recently, and so that adds a bit of complexity to the whole cycle of getting a customer on board, and it also extends the time frame somewhat. So I mean, in terms of holding the company back, that's just taking longer than had perhaps been anticipated. But there is a growing pipeline, and the company is pretty confident that it'll get some big new customers on board.
Sure. So putting the investor hat on now, what would you be looking for from Orion going forward?
Well, just that, Hamish. I think it's really getting some big customers through the door, and I think Orion's talked about for a while, having been in negotiations with some really big players in the US market, and it has signed a couple of strategic contracts just recently, one in Ontario in Canada and also another in North America. It doesn't disclose who there's with at the moment, but really investors are looking for a couple of big signings, big insurance companies or governments to really validate its position in the market as a leading provider of healthcare software, and we may get some more of that. The company is going to be releasing its full year results, properly audited results, on May 26. So there'll be more clarity given there, hopefully.
Right, something to keep an eye on. Thanks for your time, Duncan.
Yep, thanks, Hamish.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Wednesday, the 29th of April. Grant Walker will have Heads Up for you on Thursday, the 30th, from 10 o'clock. In dairy industry news, Westland Milk Products has revised its forecast 2014-15 season payout down to $4.90 to $5.10 per kilo of milk solids from the previous prediction of $5 to $5.40. The reason for the downgrade is the latest international milk auctions. Chief Executive Rod Quinn says skim milk powder out of Europe is being offered at $2,100 to $2,200 US per metric ton, which for larger global buyers is very attractive and well below offers from New Zealand of $2,600 to $2,800 US per metric ton, and the dairy auction itself, which has seen prices of $2,300 to $2,400 US per metric ton. The high value of the New Zealand dollar is a contributor to the lower forecast. The New Zealand dollar remains strong at between 76 and 77 cents against the US dollar. Mr. Quinn says Westland is well placed due to sales decisions made earlier in the season, but the cooperative will still have some exposure to the marketplace and the impact of lower prices for the remainder of the season. He says, I expect the next 3 months to be very tough, with European processors aggressively selling their peak milk. Not all European markets are producing more milk than last year, but enough are to drive an oversupplied situation. He claims current prices are unsustainable in terms of farm economics, and this could help turn the market around through a reduction in production. He predicts that milk supply in Europe and the United States will slow, as it has in New Zealand. He says Westland's milk flows are now tracking down, and we do not expect them to recover, given the lower payout forecast for this season. And that story from Chris Hutching. In news from the courts, criminal charges against Jamie Peters, a high-profile former property developer discharged from bankruptcy against the wishes of the official assignee, have been dismissed by the Auckland District Court, which found his rights to a fair trial had been breached. The official assignee, which is part of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, said corporate entities related to Peters had debts in excess of $125 million. He was due to be discharged from bankruptcy in October 2012, but that month the assignee applied to the High Court for a 3-year extension. During the ensuing public examination in court, Peters gave evidence, including witness statements. He was cross-examined, convincing Associate Judge David Abbott that there were insufficient grounds to extend his bankruptcy. In a December 2013 decision in the High Court, Associate Judge Abbott said evidence provided by the assignee was, quote, largely circumstantial and lacked sufficient detail when examined to support a finding of conduct which warranted extension to the period of bankruptcy, or to satisfy me that Mr. Peters was likely to be a risk to the business community if he was discharged, without the court imposing conditions on his discharge. The assignee wasn't finished, however, and in March last year brought charges against Peters under the Insolvency Act. Judge Philippa Cunningham said in a reserved decision dated March the 24th, I am of the view that Mr. Peters' fair trial rights have and will be compromised in any criminal proceeding. I find it difficult to see how the public interest will be served by the criminal charges proceeding, particularly given the outcome in the High Court proceedings. Former NBR Rich Lister Peters said in a statement on Wednesday that it was the second set of proceedings brought against me by the ministry and the second to fail. He said the ministry has told him it won't be appealing the district court ruling. The office of the official assignee itself came in for criticism during the hearings, including that its approach was partisan, had a mindset against Mr Peters, and used the criminal charges as a backup plan to punish him when the hearing to extend his bankruptcy failed. There was also comment that the assignee failed to provide material requested by counsel for Peters or to put up the officials involved in the assignee's report for cross-examination.
Back to the markets. New Zealand is emerging as one of the preferred property markets for global investors. This is a key finding in Collier International's Capital Markets report showing prime average commercial, retail and industrial yields in Auckland and Wellington are higher than their global counterparts. Collier's International National Research Manager Chris Dibble says the world's largest investment funds are now more than ever adopting a strategy of investing in New Zealand commercial real estate. He says while New Zealanders typically provide the lion's share of buying activity, the motivations of offshore investors searching for higher returns and asset diversification in a world with low interest rates and strong competition have changed the investor landscape. Almost half the total value of properties sold for $5 million or more last year was sold to offshore investors. This accounted for 1/5 of all transactions.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett. Open for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything in between. NBR Radio.
Everyone looks for happiness in life. So too do economists and other scholars who measure it around the world. In his Editor's Insight today, Neville Gibson looks at the latest World Happiness Report from the United Nations. Neville, what is the Happiness Report about?
Well, it's been out a couple of times and it's based on research over the last decade, and it's prepared by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This is led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who runs the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York. And he says the report provides evidence really about how well societies are, and they don't want to measure it just by money alone, but also by fairness, honesty, trust and good health. And he says the evidence here is going to help countries meet their sustainable development goals as set out by the United Nations.
So is there some kind of economic link, though, between the level of happiness and the level of well-being, economic well-being?
Yes, it's definitely got an economic or an environmental drive behind it, and there's a whole lot of economic parameters, but it's all about making your society and the environment better rather than worse, while making people feel that their lot's pretty good in life.
Where does New Zealand come in this survey?
Well, I guess many people in New Zealand have surveyed, and they were for this, would say that we should be at number one if only we had a little bit more money to go around. But that's exactly what the UN says. Australia and New Zealand come, Australia's 10th, we're just ahead of them at 9th. But there's a whole clutch of the usual suspects there from Northern Europe and Canada. These I'd call cold countries. Switzerland's at the top. There's the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden and the like, Canada and the Netherlands, all out there in front of us. So if you've got a mild and warm climate, it doesn't seem to be as much in the happiness stakes as having a richer society. I look back over previous rankings, and the top 10 and the bottom 10 haven't changed that much. Austria's dropped out of the top 10, I'm not sure why, and New Zealand's come up from 13th, that's pretty good. It's also worth noting that the 3 major European countries, the UK, Germany and France, don't even get into the top 20.
Oh, that's interesting. Who are the unhappiest countries?
Well, there's a big list of those. Togo, I don't know anyone who... Togo, Burundi, which has been in the news just lately because the president won't resign, Syria, of course, Benin, also in Africa, and a whole string of countries, mainly in Africa and where there's civil war. So, not much good going to Africa at the moment.
Well, what does the report define as happiness?
Well, there's a bit of science involved in this, and the report focuses not on momentary emotions like, are you happy right now, but did you have a good day, that sort of thing. Rather, they try and evaluate people's lives taken as a whole. And for this, they rely on the Gallup organisation, which has a a set of questions called Cantrell's Ladder. I won't go into that, but it's the standard way researchers measure life satisfaction as opposed to momentary happiness, and you rate it in a scale of 0 to 10. But the overriding conclusion is that the people who come from rich countries are considerably more satisfied with their lives than people in poor ones.
Well, others apart from the UN must also research happiness, including, I believe, the New Zealand Treasury.
That's right. The Treasury's chief economist has been speaking publicly quite a while for that, and studying happiness has become quite a leading research area in economics, not just here but around the world. In Britain they have a special happiness index there, and it all started when the King of Bhutan, it's a little... I think no longer sure that he is the king, but it's a little country
it's
up there.
It's near Nepal, isn't it?
It's right next door to Nepal and India and the Himalayas. And he came up with a thing called gross national happiness, a bit like GDP is gross domestic product. We know that as an economic concept. The OECD, the Rich Nations think tank, they came up with a Better Life Index, in which New Zealand is really at the top there. And a few weeks ago we were talking about the Social Progress Index, which is also about essentially what makes people happy. But I looked around at other surveys, and New Scientist magazine a year or so ago published the World Values Survey, because I'd heard somewhere that Nigerians were the world's most satisfied people, and sure enough, in this one they were. The findings of the researchers, and it's a bit funny here, is that material goods are actually a happiness suppressant. So the more you're anti-consumerist, the better off you probably were. New Zealand, by the way, came about 13th in that report, so we're not that consumerist, but we're still pretty happy.
Well, apart from money, how else do you measure happiness?
Well, just fleshing out a bit from the World Happiness Report, they do ask about social support. That is, have you got someone in your life you can count on? Life expectancy, which of course is a statistical measure. Freedom, you have to answer a question like, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with your freedom to choose what you want to do in your life? Generosity, that measures things like whether you've given money to charity or helped someone out. And finally, lack of government corruption, which of course in New Zealand we rate that it's very low. In other words, we rank highly in that regard. So those are the 6 variables which the researchers say explain almost 3/4 of the variations between the various countries and the rankings.
Well, let's hope we find you a happy man today, Neville. And thanks very, very much for that editor's insight into the measurement of happiness. Thanks again.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Wednesday, the 29th of April. Grant Walker will have Heads Up for you on Thursday, the 30th, from 10 o'clock. In industrial relations news, a McDonald's spokeswoman has slammed Unite Union for making excuses and not negotiating in good faith in zero-hour contract talks. On Tuesday, negotiations between the fast food giant and Unite fell through after McDonald's walked out of zero-hour contract talks. Unite Union Director Mike Treen says he was bewildered by the company's actions. He says McDonald's only presented a partial offer, which was the bare minimum of what was needed for workers. McDonald's offered 80% security of hours and up to 32 hours capped based on an average of the previous 12 weeks' worked hours. Although he believes it was a good start, Mr. Treen says it's still not good enough, and McDonald's needs to come up with a plan for securing shifts. He says, "We'd welcome the offer and want more information around how it might work with secure shifts for staff in the future." Mr. Treen says McDonald's just walked out in a huff when Unite tabled the issue instead of engaging in meaningful negotiations. But McDonald's spokeswoman Kim Bartlett has hit back at Unite, accusing the union of changing its position on the issue. She says Unite need to stop making excuses and negotiate in good faith. She says the offer further formalises the end of what has become known as zero-hour contracts at McDonald's New Zealand. Ms. Bartlett adds, "We question their commitment to the bargaining process, particularly in view of the industrial action planned in advance for Friday, which is May Day." The falling through of the negotiations yesterday triggered Unite to call for strike action from its McDonald's members on Friday. Despite this, both parties say they remain committed to reaching an agreement. Mr. Treen says, "I'm not ruling out reaching an agreement with McDonald's. We could reach an agreement today if they were willing to look at that issue and deal with a few other relatively minor issues that we want resolved." And that story from Jason Walls. In insurance industry news, shares of TAR have been halted on the New Zealand and Australian stock exchanges as it reviews its Canterbury provisions and flags a material impact ahead of reporting its first half earnings next month. In its request for a trading halt to the ASX and NZX, the insurer said in preparation for reporting its earnings in the 6 months ended March the 31st, it is reviewing its Canterbury provisions and related matters which may have a material impact. The halt comes after earlier this month it said it had, through its reinsurance program, increased its level of cover for the remaining Canterbury rebuild, amounting to an extra $50 million related to the key February 2011 earthquake. TAR said it will retain exposure to the first $30 million in costs above current reserves, but on the next $50 million of costs will bear only 12.5%, or up to $6.25 million, with the balance covered by reinsurance for the 7-year term of the agreement. The insurer said it had settled 93% by volume of claims related to the Canterbury earthquakes and expects to reach 95% by year end. The insurer also flagged that its capital holdings are well in excess of the Reserve Bank's minimum solvency requirements, giving it room to buy back as much as $34 million of its stock. At the time, it flagged the on-market buyback in May after it reported its annual results. TAR returned $56.7 million to shareholders through buybacks in January and September last year after a series of asset sales that left it with only the general insurance business. Shares of TAR last traded at $2.205 and have gained 2.6% since the start of the year. The stock remains on hold pending further announcement from the company.
To our dairy industry, a Massey University study has revealed the costs to society of New Zealand's dairy industry in a worst-case scenario approximately equal to the economic benefits of the industry. NZ Dairy Farming, Milking Our Environment for All It's Worth, written by Massey University's Professor Russell Death, Dr. Mike Joy and research technician Kailisha Foote, appeared last weekend in the US scientific journal Environmental Management. The paper highlights the exponential increases in pollution and costs to the community in the form of lost recreation opportunities and clean-up costs taking place in this country in recent decades as a result of the transformation of the dairy industry from a low-input cost impact system to high-intensity cost impact system. Dr. Joy says in a statement these costs, known as externalities, are largely not borne by the industry but rather by society at large, and these costs have in the main not been addressed and are accruing. The analysis reveals that for the worst-case scenario, using the limited number of impacts valued, the costs to society are about equal to dairy export revenue and contribution to GDP. Dr. Joy said, in other words, the industry is a zero-sum gain for New Zealand if the costs are included. He went on, a strong message from the study is that avoiding pollution is far cheaper for everyone than trying to clean it up afterward, and there is now ample evidence that farmers can make more profit and pollute less when not myopically chasing increased production. The study cites multi-million-dollar cleanups in the Rotorua Lakes, Lake Taupo and the Manawatu River, Lake Wairarapa as well, which have been funded by New Zealand taxpayers. Dr. Joy says these are just the tip of the iceberg. The degradation is far more extensive and will increase due to delays in pollution effects being seen. This is because nitrogen can take years, even decades, to move through subsurface to waterways. The paper is the first real attempt to quantify the costs to the community of dairy farming in New Zealand, and it's clear the costs or externalities are immense. Analysis reveals costs to society are about equal to dairy's export revenue and contribution to GDP.
NBR Radio. With 2 Degrees, New Zealand's smartest business people are switching to 2 Degrees.
In economics news, New Zealand business confidence has slipped from a 7-month high as sentiment waned in retailing, manufacturing, agriculture and construction. A net 30% of firms were optimistic about the general economy in April, down from 35.8% in March, according to the ANZ Business Outlook. Sentiment improved in the services sector. The survey shows business confidence remains sturdy, recording the 3rd straight month of net optimism after 6 consecutive months of pessimism. The biggest decline in April came from export intentions, which dropped to 23% from 32% in March, likely driven by the high New Zealand dollar. Cameron Bagri, ANZ Bank chief economist, says business confidence remains elevated despite easing in April. The latest survey is consistent with an economy entrenched in a robust and steady economic expansion. We continue to pencil in 3% growth over 2015. That's still centre court performance. Firms' own activity expectations slipped 1 point to what Bagri called a lofty 41%, well above the historical average of 27%. Those planning to hire more rose to 22% from 21%, while profit expectations eased back to 26% from 30%. Residential investment intentions slipped to 35% from 38%, and commercial construction intentions rose to 45% from 43%. Pricing intentions fell, with a net 23% expecting to raise prices, down from 28% in March. Inflation expectations were unchanged at 1.8%. Mr. Bagri says if such signals are sustained, the official cash rate is likely to be headed lower. The Reserve Bank's expected to keep the OCR unchanged at 3.5% on Thursday, while dropping reference to the possibility it could rise. In media news, Jurassic Park and E.T. producers Universal Studios have joined broadcasters in the Global Mode lawsuit. And fellow Hollywood heavyweight 20th Century Fox has also joined in the legal action. TVNZ, MediaWorks, Sky TV and Sparks Lightbox are suing several ISPs and tech company Bypass Network Services for copyright infringement. They take issue with the Global Mode technology that enables internet backdoor access to movies and TV shows, and have requested an expedited hearing on the matter. The case had its first formal court date on Wednesday, with lawyers from both sides appearing before Justice Sarah Katz in the High Court at Auckland. Lawyer Rick Shearer, who is representing Call Plus, Flip and Orcon, says that, as expected, the conference concerned timetabling issues. He could not say when the full hearing would be held. Mr. Shearer says Universal Studios and 20th Century Fox have joined the case as consenting parties. Universal Studios New Zealand legal counsel Matt Sumpter says he can't immediately comment on the studio's decision to join. The lawyer representing the media companies, Buddle Findley's Graham Hall, was not immediately available for comment. And that story from Victoria Young. In business news, LA-based private equity firm Oaktree Capital now has a 77.83% stake in MediaWorks, having bought out Westpac New Zealand and Royal Bank of Scotland. The two banks had partially funded private equity firm Ironbridge's 2007 purchase of the company and became shareholders when they converted their debt into equity following MediaWorks' 2013 receivership. Westpac New Zealand held just under 22% and Royal Bank of Scotland 14.6%. The bank's exit means MediaWorks now has just three shareholders: Oaktree, TPG with 15.69%, and Bain Capital subsidiary Minnow Light APAC with 6.49%. NBR Radio has approached MediaWorks for comment on the change in ownership, but has yet to receive a response.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Wednesday, the 29th of April. Grant Walker will have heads up for you on Thursday, the 30th, from 10 o'clock. In economics news, Statistics New Zealand says the trade surplus was $631 million in March, bigger than the $341 million expected in a Reuters poll of economists, and compared with a February surplus of $83 million. Excluding the re-export of a drilling platform to Singapore, last month's trade surplus was $432 million. The annual trade deficit was $2.41 billion, the biggest in almost 6 years, and ahead of last month's $2.14 billion, but smaller than the $2.74 billion expected in the Reuters poll. Annual exports to China dropped 23% in the year through to March to $8.6 billion due to weakening demand for commodities such as whole milk powder. Exports to Australia slid 4.1% to $8.65 billion, propelling Australia to the country's top export destination for the first time since the year ended November 2013. Exports in March declined 2% to $4.93 billion from the year earlier month. Imports in March rose 4.1% to $4.3 billion from the year earlier month, led by consumption goods such as clothing. In news from the courts, the Australian master franchisor for Video Easy went to court on Wednesday to take control of the movie rental chain's New Zealand outlets. Local master franchisor Video Easy International New Zealand went into voluntary liquidation last week. It had contracts with about 70 outlets across New Zealand and a licensing arrangement with the Australian company that created the brand during the 1980s. Liquidator Greg Sheriff says while a court action had been filed in the High Court at Auckland and had a first call date on Wednesday morning, it will be adjourned as he will hand over the business. Mr. Sheriff says the Australians had been asking for information from the New Zealand company and, according to them, they'd not been getting it in a timely manner. They had been preparing to go to court to enforce their rights. When they heard Video Easy was in liquidation, they got suspicious that something was going on and they wanted to protect their interests. Mr. Sheriff says the New Zealand head office fell into arrears with their licensing fees, which led to the termination of the Australian-New Zealand agreement, and as a result, the Australians were entitled to take over. He says, how it should work is that business should continue as usual, the only difference being that the franchisees don't deal with the New Zealand head franchisor, just the Australians. And that story from Victoria Young.
NBR Radio with Fuji Xerox, offering your business a whole new dimension with their 3D printers. NBR Radio.
In real estate news, one of Christchurch's prestigious Samuel Hirst Seeger-designed Fendleton residences is being sold, as is Whereas. It has a rating value of $5.5 million, with land value at $3.7 million, but the triple brick building was severely damaged in the 2010 earthquake. The owners, Denver and Sally Glass, have taken their insurance payout and moved on. Mr. Glass founded Fresh Pork New Zealand in the early 1990s. They owned the property for many years before selling to developers Dennis Thompson and Sharon Bartlett. In 2008, the Glasses bought it back in a mortgagee sale. The 1901 three-level 50-room mansion sits on 9,100 square metres of Christchurch's most expensive suburb. It has a stream boundary. It was the Governor-General's residence in 1940 and 1950, and the Duke of York, later King George VI, was among guests. The house features reception rooms, wine cellar, chiller room and butler's pantry, office wings, 6 bedrooms, and the top floor includes an entertainment room, billiard room and guest suite. Its current condition is unsound, with one corner of the building roped off, and it would require resource consent for demolition. But the land alone has value as a development prospect. Based on several other as-is, where-is sales, the vendors may well achieve more than $4 million, according to Jan-Louise Chesmar of Harcourts. As-is, where-is means there's no insurance and no EQC claims to be passed on. And that story from Chris Hutching. In broadband news, New Zealand's love affair with online streaming has spelled explosive growth for broadband provider Flip. The company has doubled its customer base in the past year from 10 to 20,000. Flip General Manager Scott Hugerbrug says the uptake of online streaming is a key reason for the influx of new customers. He says since the launch of Netflix, Flip has observed a massive increase in the amount of bandwidth being consumed. He says this has translated into more customers adopting unlimited internet plans. Mr. Hugerbrug says when we first launched unlimited plans, it was about 20% of our acquisition of customers. Now it's 60%, and I think that's directly related to streaming. In the past 12 months, Flip Digital has grown from 5 to 30% of acquisitions. Mr. Hugerbrug says that was a major part of why we doubled our customer base. We wouldn't have otherwise, as TV was actually in decline for us, so we needed a new digital channel. He says for the company to survive, it needed to move into the digital space. That allows us, he says, to do all the technical side of things in terms of the analytics and the modelling and figuring out the messages. He says the cost per acquisition of a customer has moved from $110 to $90 across the board. He says as a result of Flip utilising the Call Plus network, it's been able to undercut the competition by more than 30% since the company launched. The company's unconventional approach to marketing has also been a huge factor in Flip's success. He says the challenge for Flip is we've got a relatively small brand, so on TV we get squeezed out behind the bigger guys. They just spend more and are more recognisable. And that story from Jason Walls.
NBR Radio with Grant Thornton. Contact us to unlock your potential for growth.
Hi there, I'm John Stewart, and welcome to Last Call for Wednesday, the 29th of April. Grant Walker will have Heads Up for you on Thursday, the 30th, from 10 o'clock.
Hi there, I'm Hamish McNichol. You're listening to the week beginning April 27th's Foreign Affairs Scope with Foreign Affairs reporter Nathan Smith. Nathan, we were in Yemen last week, and I believe you want to take us back there again. So what's been the developments there?
The last week we touched on that the Saudi Arabian Air Force had sort of limited its airstrikes against the Houthis, which are a group of tribal people in the north who are backing ex-President Ali Abdullah Saleh to sort of take control of the power of that nation. They had sort of stopped airstrikes then, or sort of peeled them back as lots of targets of opportunity sort of arose and no more fixed targets were around. But they've switched from Operation Decisive Storm through to Operation Restoring Hope now.
That sounds a bit more perky.
Well, that's right. It's a little bit of a step change now to the next phase of the engagement, in the same way that Desert Shield in 1991 moved to Desert Storm. This is simply the same operation. It's just a new phase. The Saudi Arabia will be looking now at basically keeping the momentum low from the Houthis and making sure that the allies in the regime, Hadi's forces in the south, aren't overwhelmed.
Right.
So
their efforts last week did break the back of the Houthis a bit then?
Yeah, it stopped, it blunted their force. They're still moving, but lots of their supply lines, logistics and fixed assets have now been degraded or destroyed. And that from the Saudis' perspective is a good indicator that it's time to move on to the next phase. Now that they have complete air superiority as well, they'll be able to start supporting people down there.
Right, and so what's the ultimate goal of restoring hope then? Do we know?
It looks like they're basically trying to play a status quo of... because they're not going to take back the territory that the Houthis have gained in the north and down to the south. So they're trying to make sure that they don't gain too much more. But they're basically going to have to start to balance those two forces and realise that Yemen, as it used to be, no longer looks as it does now and will not look so in the future. So they're trying to sort of reach a level where Yemen will be somewhat stable, but not... a cohesive entity like it was, and technically it hasn't been for a long time. It's run through different iterations of civil war and internecine fighting and sectarian conflict all the time. It's just a matter of which outside power can leverage as much control, and that seems to be what Saudi Arabia are looking for here: a long-term negotiated solution of various different tribal groups.
And is that a fair sort of compromise, do you think?
It's reality.
Right.
They would prefer, a lot of people would prefer to have their people in control there. It's not going to happen. So there's really just looking at what can happen now and what can't, and then just working with that. Right,
okay. Moving elsewhere then as well, there's some reports recently about a controversial drone killing. Do you want to get into that for us?
Yeah, sure. So Obama's under a little bit of fire, which is an ironic thing to say, with a drone strike that happened in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border last week. They weren't aware, he says, that there were two foreign hostages in the house that was struck. One was an Italian, one was an American. They're both dead. But intelligence is always piecemeal, and you sort of make the best of your decisions on what you have. You can never have perfect intelligence. So it's a little unfair for a lot of people to talk about this as being a what do you say, like a bad decision. This is a decision you had to make.
Right.
So we're looking now at the political dynamics behind calling Obama out on this. Seems to be the ongoing view of drones as being machine warfare, or non-personal, or it's just a different kind of warfare that seems to be making people a little bit antsy about this. So that seems to be what's going on.
Okay, and so Al-Qaeda ultimately responsible for this?
I think so. That needs to be kept in the forefront of people's minds. The hostage takers and the militants that are involved in this are to blame for what the US is doing. They're trying to keep them down.
Their hand is forced a bit, right? Isn't it? The US's? They have.
It is. When you have partial intelligence and you know these people are there and you're watching them for a while, it's hard to know all of the intelligence. But at least when you have prime targets in a certain place, you need to make that decision. And the decision was made, and unfortunately, there were Americans and foreigners involved in that.
Did they get any of these prime targets, or?
Yeah, they have. And in the past couple of months, actually. More controversy has sort of been spilling around that America recently released that it killed 2 American citizens in other drone strikes around who were actually fighting on behalf of Al-Qaeda in January. So this sort of stuff is sort of milling in the political consciousness in America. But needless to say, America is still technically at war with this force, and will do everything it can in a lot of different countries to bring that fight to the enemy rather than let the enemy come closer.
And you mentioned people are sort of getting antsy about these drones, but how do they fit in, as an option for these sorts of strikes? Are they still a good choice, or are there people suggesting that they should be put to bed? Or
yeah, well, there's obviously as many different military options as you can think of military assets. When it comes to using drones, it appears to me and others that they're the safest of many different kinds of options. You can send special forces in on the ground, but even they make mistakes, and then you have the possibility of sending some back in body bags as well if something goes wrong. A drone can't kill any friendly person because no one flies it, and they can loiter above targets for days and see with an unblinking eye what's going on, only to choose the best, most safe time to launch the missile. And when they do that, they limit as many civilian casualties as possible because the blast radius is quite small. So although it appears to be a very calculated, cruel way of killing people, it's the most efficient, probably the most safe, at least for the Allied forces, coalition forces, that we've ever discovered. So it will continue to be the prime tool for counter-terrorism in the future. And in fact, a lot of the rules that have come out over the past couple of years about engagement of forces overseas do not talk about drones as being highly constricted. They're still getting a lot of leeway on this because they're quite useful.
Okay. And I guess continuing with this US theme as well, we had Abe visiting Washington over the past week. Do you want to update us on that?
That's right. So he's visiting Washington, Boston, I think San Francisco as well, to talk about a number of things. The top on the list will be the economic situation in both Japan and the United States, and how more integration between the two nations will help both their situations, especially in regards to unemployment and Abe's 3 arrows to get his economy back up and running. A big piece of that is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mm-hmm. While he's in Washington, that will be one of the big things they talk about. That will sort of help both Japan and the United States, but it appears to be more important for Japan at this point, even though they're the ones, slowing things down in regards to not making the decisions on the agricultural lobbies or anything. They still see this as being the largest piece of the puzzle they need to push their economy forward. Right. And in regards to China as well, they see this as being a large leverage against the domination there. But you're also talking about Abe discussing better security arrangements with the United States for collective defense. All these things show to me that Japan and the United States are coming closer and working as a cooperative entity rather than two different nations.
Okay. And so you mentioned Japan sort of taking this all slowly and stuff like that, but I mean, it sounds like it might be in their interest to also, get it over and done with as well. So how's this sort of, if you're saying that their partnership is strengthening, what does this mean for these sorts of negotiations going forward? Is it looking like it's...
Yeah. Currently, the fast track, which is the a piece of legislation that Obama needs so that he can present the TPP to Congress and they can just give a simple up or down vote on it and no amendments. Mm-hmm. That is pending at the moment. And the reason that it's pending now is because they're sort of waiting on a discussion about what the US will do when it comes to the TPP. The TPP has been a US story from the start. As soon as they came in, it was in New Zealand and there were a few other people at the beginning, but once the US came in, it became their story. Yeah. And everybody that has come in after that has sort of been waiting for the United States to put their cards on the table. What are they going to do? Because it's very, very much more difficult for Japan and the rest of the other TPP countries to make concessions and spend political capital in their own countries if the US is simply going to turn around and say, actually, we don't want to do that. Mm. So we've been waiting for the US to be very clear on what its goals are and what it wants to do. And once the fast track legislation comes through, Japan will then know what it can and can't do in regards to spending its political capital. And we suspect that's one of the large reasons why it's now in Abe is now in Washington talking about this. Is that there's some very close discussion about what the US wants here. Okay,
and so you've noted here as well, as part of Abe's trip, he also visited Silicon Valley. Was that sort of related to this, or just over and above?
Yeah, so that was one of the unmentioned, unreported visits that he will do after these visits. So that's coming up in the next couple of days.
Right.
Again, that's the sort of part of reinvigorating his economy. Mm-hmm. How does the Japanese high-tech industry and IT industry get closer to the US, and in regards to the large innovation coming out of both those countries? Bringing ties together would actually help quite a lot, because that appears to be where you can make a lot of capital these days. So that's a very important part of his trip.
Sure. Okay. And last week we went into Ukraine a bit, and there's been some Russian scare tactics involving Russia and Ukraine this week. So what's that been about?
Yeah, we've got more reports as the ground is thawing over these weeks of Russian battalions and armour, also artillery pieces moving closer to the border, especially into the captured or separatist regions. And it appears to some analysts that they may be gearing up for a major offensive into those regions to completely secure them. But for others, it's simply a way, as you said, of scare tactics, of pressuring Kiev and maybe the West, and especially Berlin now, into making concessions about what they want to do with that region.
Right.
There was some suggestion recently that a land bridge would be forced from the eastern parts of Ukraine down underneath the south into Crimea, and once that would happen, the Russians would have control of, effectively, as I said, a land bridge down to Crimea. But that would be a pretty major offensive. That would be regular US Russian forces invading a sovereign country. That doesn't appear to be likely. Mm-hmm. It's on the cards, but a major Russian offensive doesn't appear to be likely in the future elsewhere either. So they're just pre-positioning and making it look like they can.
Right. So, yeah, all part of sort of flexing the muscles, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, okay. And there seems to be minor clashes continuing in East Ukraine as well?
Yep, and in saying that, the ceasefire seems to be holding tentatively. Neither of the two sides completely came to the terms of that ceasefire by moving the artillery pieces outside the ranges. So there have been Grad rockets and MLRS fire and artillery fire in those areas ever since the ceasefire began. But it appears to be holding at the moment. But the pieces of those separatists and loyalist troops are repositioning, as you do in a ceasefire, pretty much getting prepared for and waiting for the next movement.
Okay. So overall, how do we interpret these movements of the Russian troops? What does it mean?
It appears that both Kiev and Moscow, especially Putin and Moscow, have an understanding that to go too much further into this requires quite a decent escalation. Neither of them, I think, have the political will to do this currently. And with the US dropping in its own paratroopers for training purposes in the region, it also shows that the US might actually have a lot more will to do something about an escalation as well. So there's a lot more ambiguity and a lot more worry that if an escalation does happen, it could spill into something quite larger and bring in a far bigger part of that region. Right. So there seems to be some tentative comfortability with what's happened. And we essentially freeze this conflict for a while, as none of these areas that have been fought over are sort of either Russian or Ukrainian or Russian-Ukrainian. They are just sort of unknown at the moment. And I think that's better politically for Putin than it is for Kiev to keep this ambiguous.
Okay.
But I don't think either of them are looking for an escalation in the immediate term. I could be wrong.
All right. All right, Nathan, well, thanks very much for your time, and thanks for listening to this week's NBR Foreign Affairs Scope.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.